Tonight we welcome back Parag Khanna, author of How to Run the World. So far this week, we have been taking a look at the new leadership models and shifting world order. Tonight, we look at the new Arab reality. The opening of borders is a cornerstone achievement of the European Union. Will there be a day when we see such a change in the Arab world? Hi again, Parag.
Hello.
You write a lot about borders and you lecture on that and the nature of borders. How does this apply to the Arab world?
Well, we're obviously experiencing this incredible sea change in the Arab geopolitical and political landscape, really akin to what happened 50, 60 years ago with independence revolutions, post-colonialism, and so on. At that time, there was a notion of pan-Arabism, right? The idea of a unified bloc of Arab countries that, again, was anti-colonial, pro-independence, all these kinds of things. But then it really retreated into strongman rule, strong nationalism, and so on. Today, and a lot of people might say it's too early to talk about this, but I believe that if you combine what's happening today in terms of tossing out old governments, bringing new ones, and then the generational psychology of young Arabs, and globalization, migration, intra-Arab movements, and capital flows and opportunities, you have the recipe for a new kind of pan-Arabism, a new kind of borderless Arab world. Already you see young Arabs moving all across borders, from Morocco all the way to the Persian Gulf. Dubai and Doha and Abu Dhabi are these melting pots now. They've got their satellite television, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, everyone is watching it. There's a unified Arab conversation that there has not been in a very long time. That is the first ingredient in this sort of new borderless Arabism that I think, and again, the big caveat is, we still have to see how things shake out from Libya to Syria and elsewhere, and even Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and so forth over time. But I do think that there is this common generational psychology that is very promising.
Psychology or a feeling, but is there a real push for closer relations between Arab nations?
Well, if you look at the actual numbers, yes, because what happened after 9/11, and very few people have paid attention to it, even though it's a staggering statistic, but in the previous oil booms of the 70s and so forth, the Persian Gulf governments would take all their money and recycle it into Swiss bank accounts and London and for weapons, right? Today, things are a little bit different. Yes, they're still buying lots of weapons, but since 9/11, 85, 90% of the massive commodities boom of the last decade has been reinvested within the Arab world, right? Lots of construction, lots of activity, lots of cross-border economic flows across the entire Arab world, largely fueled actually by Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf governments. That has meant that there is a certain amount of codependence or recognition of this sort of pan-Arab economic realm. Then I mentioned migration earlier. I meet young Tunisians and Moroccans in the Persian Gulf countries, and I see the movement that's going on across them. I hope that the infrastructure will start to follow, that there is this investment in infrastructure that is actually going to help to really knit the region together and allow that cross-border flow to happen more as well.
Because you talk about without infrastructure, independence is futile,
Right.
is what you say.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, specifically in the case of Palestine, we've focused for the past decades and decades on these rose garden ceremonies and negotiations and treaties that haven't really brought peace. We focused only on the political and not on the economic, not on the infrastructural. If Palestine were to be independent tomorrow, and it's becoming independent almost tomorrow, literally as we sit here, what is its economic basis and foundation for being a functional, sovereign, independent country? What capacity is it going to have to provide for its people and to employ them and give them jobs and welfare? Well, very, very little, because we've been focusing on the political and not enough on the infrastructure. So yes, independence without infrastructure is futile. That is precisely how I phrase it, and that's exactly what I mean. That applies to many countries in the region, actually.
Give me another example, because Palestine's always a tricky example.
Right.
It sort of stands alone. So
Well,
give me
here's
another
an example of a country that's building the infrastructure without the independence or a territory, and that's Kurdistan, right? Kurdistan will eventually get its independence from Iraq, and Iraq might very well fall apart as the U.S. Withdraws or fall apart again. The Kurds have been very busy striking all kinds of energy and oil deals and getting investment from Canada, from Norway, from the U.S., from all sorts of others, saying, we're not an independent country yet, but we're going to build airports, roads, pipelines, all kinds of things, such that when the moment is right, we're going to declare our independence and we're going to be strong. We're going to have our own military, we're going to have our own airports, we're going to have people who are vested in supporting our independence because they've got their money parked here, because they're buying our resources. They've got pipelines flowing out of here. Palestine should be doing the same thing. If the West Bank and Gaza, in other words, if Hamas and Fatah can create this kind of reconciliation, and if there were an infrastructure corridor linking them, which is called the ARC, it was a Rand Corporation proposal from some years ago that's gotten a lot of support. If you actually create that physical unity, you have a much more viable state. And that state is going to become independent, like it or not. So it really should get its economic
So a bridge
acts together.
between Gaza and the West Bank.
It's a physical bridge. And then remember, you actually have a port on the Mediterranean Sea. Very important lifeline, access to the outside world. Kurdistan is doing very well as a landlocked territory. Palestine at least has access to the sea. It has potential. It doesn't have to be this dependent, occupied zone forever.
If we talk about pan-Arab nationalism across the Arab world, what does the relationship, a new relationship between the countries look like? Is this the rich Gulf states sort of be telling the poor and more discombobulated rest of the Middle East what to do, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, those oil-rich Sunni Arab kingdoms, obviously do have a certain amount of sway in the region. A lot of military power, strong relation, a lot of money. They just invited Morocco and Jordan to join the GCC, which was obviously a sign of their political support for those countries. Even if that doesn't happen, it just shows how much power they have. But no, it's not one dictating to the other. But yes, there is all Arab countries are not the same. You have your oil-rich monarchies and your resource-poor monarchies like Oman, right? So Saudi Arabia and Oman, they're both monarchies, but they're two totally different economies, right? Then you have your resource-rich non-monarchies and your sort of authoritarian, secular sort of states that have resources, and then those that don't. So you have many different kinds of states within the Arab world, and so there is going to have to be some amount of resource transfer among them, infrastructure being built among them. There are ideas out there for pipelines from the Persian Gulf countries to Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, countries that don't have a lot of natural resources. How about water maybe flowing in the other direction? So lots of these ideas that hinge ultimately on infrastructure. And when you build that physical unity, that changes the politics, right? Anyone can have a generic conversation about how, no, we're proud Syrians, we're proud Egyptians, we're not going to take orders from them. Once you physically connect the countries and they depend on each other, they all start to change their tune. That's the story of Europe, after all, isn't it?
It is, but when you look at the Arab world, I mean, I don't see people out on the streets today chanting for, a great pan-Arab nationalism. They're chanting for a great whatever, a great Egypt, a great Syria. So there it seems to me, at any rate, that there needs to be a fundamental mind shift here.
Right. Well, hold on. Excuse me. What have we just experienced in the last 6 months? Why is it that what happened in Tunisia had this domino effect on Egypt, on Syria, on Yemen, on Morocco, and all these other countries, and on Libya? It's not by accident. No way. They're listening to each other. They are seeing a common fate. Otherwise, what happened in one country would not have any impact on what's happening anywhere else. If ever we are seeing the potential for this sort of collective movement to take place, it's absolutely right now. The evidence we're seeing on our television sets every single day that they're influencing each other and have a collective stake, a collective outcome.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned the European Union. What lessons can be taken from the countries in the European Union where many of the continent's borders are now open? Apply that to a potential Arab world.
Right. There's some very important lessons. First of all, small, poor, landlocked, especially post-World War II, devastated countries needed to band together and realize that they have to become something more than the sum of their parts. The European Union has actually succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of its creators. Again, Greece, Portugal, notwithstanding. I mean, these are problems of success in a number of these countries, right? So let's appreciate what it has become. So that's a lesson there, obviously. Small, post-colonial, not really, ideologically coherent Arab states today can actually create a new identity that's more meaningful if they think about that cross-border pan-Arab identity in a new way. That's one major lesson. Another is the economic advantages, right? I mean, they absolutely have to share resources, and they have interdependencies. Energy and water are just examples of that. So there's Europe as well. Look at the cross-border economic strength and development and joint ventures and things like Airbus, right, a Franco-German kind of venture. So the Arab world could use a lot more of that. It would create a lot of jobs. You could really build industry that way. So that's another lesson. Again, this whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The Arab world is so easily divided by outsiders. Of course, divide and rule, right? That's what they're accusing Israel and and America and everyone else of having done for decades. Well, now is their chance to say, we have a collective voice, we have a collective worldview, we're going to implement it.
Yeah, you call it, what is it, post-colonial entropy?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of this fragmentation of these countries is not an accident, right? It's happening, yes, there are immediate triggers, but the fact is that all of these countries in the last 60 years have experienced corrupt rule, quadrupling of their populations, no new investment in infrastructure, disenfranchisement, youth bulges, right, unemployed young people, a crisis of succession where you don't know who's going to take over. Can the son really take over from the father? All of this has happened at the same time in all of these countries, not just because of WikiLeaks or because of the Tunisian fruit vendor who self-immolated, right? It's also happening because for the last 60 years, all of these common things have been happening in these countries. That's post-colonial entropy, which is just a fancy way of saying they've been dying since they were born, these countries, because they haven't been governed right. So now they have to rebuild themselves from scratch.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to read something that you wrote earlier this year in a foreign policy article. Here's some of what you said. The Arab League's backing of a no-fly zone in Libya and its ongoing consideration of peacekeeping forces for Palestine and Lebanon are striking examples of a meaningful transnational Arab political sphere coming into being. Parag, the Arab League, 22 countries, right, has had a history of inaction and disagreement. I don't think a lot of people are running around holding up the Arab League as a great example of this. Not very much consensus, not a lot of action. So there are your critics who are going to say, you're holding up two very slim examples in the face of so much contradictory evidence. What do you say to that?
The Arab League suffers from decades of inaction. My first book, I had a whole section sort of, lambasting it, right? And so the fact that they've done just two things is actually amazingly remarkable. Now, I think the real critique of what I wrote is that the actions they took were incredibly cynical, right, and self-serving. No one likes Gaddafi. That's why they were able to say, sure, go ahead, bomb him, right? Have your no-fly zone. Qatar will even, the UAE will even send airplanes and troops. Why not? Because no one likes Gaddafi. Then the Arab League also seems to be mum on the issue of this intervention in Bahrain that Saudi Arabia has led, America has turned a blind eye, and so forth. Again, pretty self-serving and cynical because no one wants to see what they're painting as a Shia Iranian fifth column get this bridgehead into Bahrain. So what I am praising is clearly the result of some pretty cynical kinds of calculations, without a doubt. But the same is true of even worthy interventions that the West has led in other places, right? I mean, don't so many people say they went into Iraq for the oil, right? Or what is it that you really want in Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? So, I mean, it's very hard to have a pure, perfect, totally noble humanitarian venture intervention. But the Arab League at least has not said, get out of our way, this is an internal problem, we'll handle it, and then done absolutely nothing. Because that's pretty much where the bar has been. It's about down here. But again, my model for the future Arabism is not the old model of the Arab League, right? It's something very new. It's something very much that's business and economic and cultural and demographic, and not so much about central formal institutions headquartered in Cairo, right? So I do think that that potential is there. There's no reason for those two to be antithesis in sort of opposition to each other. But I think we have arrived at a situation where the Arab League is not blocking that new Arabism from taking hold organically.
I want to ask you, this last wave of pan-Arab nationalism we saw was with Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s and into the 60s. It had limited success by, I think, almost anyone's measure. What's different this time? I mean, there's a lot going on right now in the Middle East, but what is different this time that leads you to believe that it could work?
I think that the Arab world and Arab leadership and Arab citizens have realized either that the world has passed them by, it's been globalizing, developing, modernizing, and for a long time, and they haven't. So this is their last chance. They need to exploit what they have and take advantage of their role in global markets. Their central geographic position, my God, the Middle East is the physical center, the crossroads of the planet. How can they not be taking full advantage of this? And there's the Dubai effect, right? There wasn't a Dubai 25, 30, 40 years ago. The Arab world is looking and saying, there are places that are succeeding. They're developing, they're modern, they're growing. They're the tallest buildings in the world. Everyone there seems to be living well, right? And
beyond well.
Beyond well. And Dubai, of course, doesn't have oil, right? Or very little oil. Now, they've had to be bailed out. They had a bubble, of course, but it continues apace. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Things are going absolutely fine over there. They have a lot of debt restructuring they have to do, but life there is good for a lot of people. Arabs are seeing this and saying, we need to get on that wagon, right? And we're not going to do it by hermetically closing ourselves off and saying, yes, there's a Yemeni way, yes, there's a Libyan way, yes, there's an Egyptian way. No way is what I say to that. They need each other very much. Egypt depends on investment from Saudi Arabia very strongly, and so do other countries as well. So they have no choice but to get together.
Parag, Khanna, thank you for an excellent week of great analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pia. It's been a lot of fun.